For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. Today we're discussing U.S. China Relations with Bonnie Glaser. She's the Managing Director of the GMF's Indo-Pacific program. Ms. Glaser, welcome back to India, and extremely glad to have an in-person interview finally after a few online ones, and that too in our office.
Great to be here in person with you.
There's lots happening. We've seen the Wang and Blinken's meeting, some statements that are coming out, and that's in complete contrast to the first set of meetings that Blinken's officials had with the Chinese. I think it was in March 2021 in Alaska. What has changed so much over those years?
Well, I think really for the first year, the Chinese hoped that the Biden administration would return to the policies of the Obama administration. And they were, I think, surprised that so much was inherited from the Trump administration, particularly the assessment of China posing a major threat to the United States. We now see in documents that are being released by the Biden administration that China is the only country that really has both the ambition and the capability to revise the international order in ways that would be detrimental to the United States, its partners, its allies, to democracies. And so over time, I think the Chinese have come to accept that the U.S. China relationship is predominantly competitive. Although they don't like that frame, they would like us to say that this is a cooperative relationship. But yet the Chinese have not accepted the Biden administration's push for having a focus on how to manage our differences and prevent the competition from veering into conflict. And the mill-mill relationship is essentially frozen, particularly since our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, visited Taiwan in August of 2022. That has not resumed. But nevertheless, there is a desire now on the part of China to stabilize the relationship. We started this when the presidents met 1 year ago in Bali. And then, of course, we had a Chinese spy balloon fly over the United States. And that led to repercussions that were difficult to manage between the two countries. And so now I think we're really trying again. And because of the economic headwinds that China is facing and the Chinese dissatisfaction with U.S. policies that are trying to hamper China's innovation through our export controls and other means to slow down China's technological development in areas that are connected to national security, I think that China has also an incentive, a stake in trying to stabilize the relationship. So for different reasons, I think the U.S. and China are trying again, and we will see what will be achieved, which is just about a month from now, when Xi Jinping will probably arrive in San Francisco for the APEC summit.
Exactly. This is what it's probably leading up to in, I think it's 14th to 16th of November, the APEC summit, and if they have a bilateral summit as well. What are both sides looking for in terms of best case or worst case scenarios? He could possibly not come also for that particular summit.
Well, I think both sides have low expectations. Certainly in the Biden administration, the messages are that expectations should be very low. There won't be major outcomes. But there are some things that the United States would like to achieve. We have a serious problem in the United States with fentanyl addiction. A lot of Americans that die of this addiction every year. And some of these chemical precursors come from China. And so the United States would like to resurrect our law enforcement cooperation with China on this issue. And China is very transactional. They want to get something for it. The United States imposed sanctions on a lab in China. And so that could be a give and take. where we end up with some increased Chinese cooperation. This is important for President Biden because we are heading into an election year. And of course, Biden is running for re-election. So this is something, it's a campaign issue. And then other than that, the United States would like to resume the cooperation between the two militaries, and that is something President Biden will talk to Xi Jinping about. When Xi Jinping was vice president, he came to the United States and he went to the Pentagon. And I was told he came away with an understanding that we have to have communication between our two militaries. We have to avoid misperception and miscalculation. And so this is something that I think Biden will remind him of, and hopefully there will be an agreement to have more dialogue and more operational conversation between our militaries. It's almost on a daily basis that we are seeing our Navy ships and our Air Force and China's Air Force in close calls. And the China Military Power Report, which was just released a couple of weeks ago by the Pentagon, the annual report, for the first time said that in a 2-year period between the fall of 2021 and 2023, there are 180 coercive and risky actions in the air by the Chinese Air Force against the United States, and 100 against U.S. allies and partners. And so these numbers are considerable. If you looked at them in the overall context of the total number, we don't know what that is. It's a classified figure, but it's probably a small percentage, but nonetheless, it is rising and it is dangerous. And so our militaries do need to talk. And I think other than that, there's a desire by the United States to find more areas to cooperate with China. We want to test the proposition that we can compete and cooperate at the same time. And so John Kerry, our climate envoy, has been leading the effort to try and get China and the United States to find a way in the run-up to COP28 to cooperate. So I think that will be on the agenda as well. And then China will have its list of concerns. They will talk about the technology restrictions. They will talk about Taiwan, as they always do. And Xi Jinping will be looking for more reassurances from President Biden, and maybe some statements about what we might do if there is an election of another DPP president in Taiwan, who Beijing fears might really push for legal, formal independence. And Xi Jinping might even be looking for some promises from the United States that we would not allow that to happen.
You talked about one of the areas of possible cooperation, which is climate change, and you mentioned the Special Envoy John Kerry. Californian governor was also in China, and he had an audience with Xi Jinping, no less. And apparently after that said China-U.S. ties should not be held hostage to situation. But are there still two kinds of voices in the U.S. on policy in terms of, like you said, there are documents, security documents, which outline the main threat is China in the coming years, who want closer ties, closer business ties, because there are some analysts who say the U.S. contributed a lot to the rise of China because of its engagement post-1970. And now you see a monster that you created. But because of the business ties, despite this de-risking, or nobody talks about decoupling anymore, are there two kind of strands of voices of what U.S.-China policy should be?
Well, we, of course, have many different voices in the United States, and there are people who come from different sectors who would like to preserve good relations with China. We see this in universities, scientific cooperation. There's been a lot of cooperation in Silicon Valley with Chinese companies that have really benefited the United States. We used to work in medical labs and with China. We fought Ebola together in Africa. So there has been some cooperation in the past that some people think should go on regardless of how competitive the relationship is. But there are a lot of people who are concerned about having Chinese in the United States who have expertise in STEM areas. They want fewer even students to come. So you do have some extremes of people. But generally speaking, I think there is an understanding China poses a lot of challenges to the United States in any area that's connected to national security. There is greater understanding. And the business community's attitudes have changed fundamentally. I think what the business community wants is predictability. They want, and not just from the U.S. government, but also from the Chinese government, because they don't want to run afoul of Chinese law inadvertently. We're seeing businessmen, not just Americans, but also Japanese occasionally, getting detained in various companies in China. So this is not a good trend. But businesses in the United States, there are some that are hiving off their China business, separating it from the rest of their business because they want to be able to operate in China and comply with Chinese law, but they also don't want to put at risk all of their other data and other business that they have. So there's some, of course, that are moving, companies that are moving some of their business elsewhere. And we see that here in India with Apple investing and building production here. And I think that there will be others that will follow.
The California governor, I think, post his visit and meeting with Xi Jinping, said being granted an audience indicated a thaw in relations. One, is that how you see it progressing? And how does that sit with exactly what you mentioned, which is a high number of incidents, whether it's with the U.S. or its allies? We've seen collisions with the Philippines Navy as well. How do those two strands sit in when policy is made from the U.S. side?
Well, I don't think that we should anticipate a thaw in U.S. China relations, and certainly not a reset. There's lots of nouns we could use. I would go with stabilization as the best case outcome. And that is not a certainty. The question is really whether there's enough that our two countries can agree on in terms of how we manage our differences. And Xi Jinping will probably come up with a set of maybe principles. I don't know if bilaterally we're ready to agree on principles. When the two leaders met in Bali, it was Xi Jinping's initiative to have officials from both sides talk about the principles that guide the relationship. The United States is very leery about things like mutual respect, right? Win-win cooperation. Mutual respect means respecting each other's core interests. And China's definition of core interests is not limited. Even if it were, we have a problem with Taiwan, Tibet, and Xinjiang being core interests, but it's expanded beyond that. So I don't think we will come up with a common set of principles. But I do think that we can change the tone in the relationship. Perhaps we can find areas to cooperate. And importantly, if we can agree that communication channels have to remain open between our diplomats, between our militaries, if we can agree that there are areas in people-to-people exchanges that are still important, sub-regional cooperation, which is, of course, what Xi Jinping was endorsing when he met with the governor of California. That's an area where possibly in climate change, things like that, that we'd like to see cooperation. But I think it's going to be very limited. I don't think we are going to see a shift in the focus of the United States on protecting ourselves, our interests, our supply chains, our intellectual property from the threats that China poses.
And Ms. Glaser, then, if things go south or continue the way they are in terms of aggression that the Chinese we've been seeing, whether towards the U.S. or the allies like Philippines, when does it come to a stage when, say, the Mutual Defense Treaty has to be, worked out between action has to be taken there? What will it provoke that red line to be crossed? And how significant do you think the latest ROK, Japan, and U.S. exercises have been in that area?
Well, the general issue, really, that you're framing here is that U.S. cooperation with our allies has really been strengthened under the Biden administration. There's been new coalitions that are being built, whether we talk about The Quad being upgraded, AUKUS, the U.S., Australia, and the U.K., and now the U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral cooperation, which has really jumped to a new stage that we have never seen before. Whether it will be institutionalized is still a question mark. Leaders change. Something can happen in the issue that could be in the relationship between Japan and Korea that could revive the historical differences, the antagonism. We hope that does not happen because we believe that we really have very strong shared security interests. And so the goal of the Biden administration is really to put that trilateral relationship on an irreversible track to the extent that we can. And the Philippines has been a relationship that is going from strength to strength. And this is, of course, partly a function of the change in government in the Philippines, where President Marcos, I think, believes that holding the United States a little bit closer is in his interests. He's very unhappy about the Chinese pressure and harassment that's taking place in the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And we have seen Chinese pressure go from use of lasers to use of water cannons to most recently ramming the Philippines vessels. And it's quite noteworthy that the Philippines' reaction to this has been to release videos for the first time ever of these incidents that are taking place. And in the most recent incident, we saw a large Chinese Coast Guard ship that had what was something like a bumper. And you could see from where it was positioned on the ship that it was intended to protect their vessel from a smaller boat, like a Chinese maritime militia boat. So they were ready to ram into the Philippines boat. And I think this means that there's a question for the United States as to how we respond. We have had P-8 aircraft fly overhead. We have had destroyers that have been at a fairly close distance, but the United States has not yet taken what could be the next step of escorting the rotation and resupply operations that the Philippines is conducting. There's been initiatives in the United States to go so far as to deploy our own Marines on Second Thomas Shoal. I don't think that's likely. But I do think that there, at this point, is likely serious consideration about whether we should escort these operations, because otherwise we are getting to a point where it is very dangerous. The Chinese are testing the United States to see whether we will, in fact, operationalize our mutual defense treaty to defend the Philippines. And that this happened right after the invasion or the attack by and from the Hamas on Israel. I interpret that also as a test of the United States to see whether we were distracted. So I think we are in a dangerous period, and the United States needs to demonstrate resolve so that the Chinese do not miscalculate.
There are many who say that the Chinese / the Russians are trying to open a third front against the U.S. Exactly what you were talking about, testing U.S. resolve. You mentioned Taiwan a couple of times. How do you see that issue developing? Because, of course, elections are also around the corner there.
The Chinese are concerned about the possibility of another DPP president being elected in Taiwan. We've already had 8 years of the DPP rule, and they see William Lai Ching-te as very radical. One Chinese said to me that he combines the worst of Chen Shui-bian and Tsai Ing-wen, the two prior DPP presidents. I think that they probably misjudge him. They certainly misjudged Tsai Ing-wen, and they missed an opportunity with her, I think, to come to more of an understanding and stabilize the relationship. But partly for domestic reasons, they have refused to talk to Tsai Ing-wen. And so I think just right out of the box, if William Lai is elected, the Chinese will react quite strongly. We've seen in the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit The Chinese essentially have erased the center line in the Taiwan Strait. They operate their Navy ships and their aircraft up to 24 nautical miles, just the edge of that contiguous zone, right outside of Taiwan. And I would not be surprised if one of the things that they do is go even closer to Taiwan, maybe even sailing and flying in the 12 nautical mile territorial air and sea space, which would be very provocative. But of course, the Chinese don't recognize that it's Taiwan's airspace and sea space. But they are looking to restore their red lines and to demonstrate their own resolve so that they want the United States to restrain Lai Ching-te, and they want to ensure that Taiwan does not push for independence again. And Xi Jinping, so we've been told by the head of our CIA, Bill Burns, Xi Jinping has told the People's Liberation Army that they should be prepared to take over Taiwan in 2027. That doesn't mean he's made a political decision to invade. I believe that he doesn't have much confidence in his military. We can see that by the purges that have taken place in recent months, particularly the two at the head of the rocket force, which really signals to me that that he is not satisfied with the military's preparations for that key mission of invading Taiwan. So I think that he does not really want to have war with the United States, but he wants to signal very clearly what China's bottom line is. And if pushed to a corner, I do not doubt that even if he's not confident that the PLAs can succeed, he will use force. There are various contingencies. People talk about blockades or seizing the outer islands. I myself think those are less likely. I think if Xi Jinping decides that force has to be used, he's going to go for the full juggernaut and he will try a full-scale invasion of Taiwan. But I think if the United States is committed and prepared, capable, and Taiwan's military forces are capable, that we can deter China. Because it would be perhaps a death blow to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party and to Xi Jinping's position if the PLA tries to invade and fails.
Talking about preparedness, and you mentioned it a couple of times, U.S. documents, whether they were the DOD's China military paper that came out, or I think there's a bipartisan congressional paper on U.S. nuclear deterrence as well, which has a lot of critique of current position. How do you, if you would like to flesh those out?
Well, the China Military Power Report has a lot of information in it that is really useful. It tracks on an annual basis what the developments are in the Chinese military. And the nuclear area is quite notable. This year's report says that by May of 2023, the Chinese had 500 operational nuclear warheads. And they are on track to have 1,000 by the end of the decade. And then 2035, it's estimated that they will have 1,500. The Chinese are filling the silos that we found through our satellites that they dug. So a very large number of them. We don't know if they will fill all of them with ICBMs, but these are solid fuel missiles, and they will give China a launch-on-warning capability that they have not had in the past. So that will put them on a hair trigger, which will make the situation more dangerous. And then to complicate things further, China is now developing a conventionally armed ICBM. So we already have problems with the dual-use systems that China has and our inability to distinguish between nuclear and conventional systems. And this will take it to the level of the long-range intercontinental systems, which has not existed in the past. They're developing a new nuclear submarine. Their JL-3, which is their sea-launched missile, is now deployed on their SSBNs, which is really significant because that means they can reach the continental U.S. from China's territory. They don't have to go sail out to the Western Pacific any longer. So there's a whole range of developments. The number of platforms in the Navy just that have increased in the last year. They're producing these like sausages, and the U.S. is very far behind in terms of the number of Navy platforms in particular that we have. And they have a large number of fourth-generation aircraft as well, more than probably all of our allies put together. So the threat is really significant, and it could potentially make it very costly for the United States to intervene to defend Taiwan. That's what China wants us to conclude, that it's too costly. And so this is one of the reasons why the United States is diversifying its military posture in the Indo-Pacific region. The facilities in the Philippines will be particularly important. So in our original EDCA agreement, there were 5 facilities. That's now been expanded to 9. And of course, we're expanding our operations in Guam. So a lot more work to be done, but I think the Biden administration is focused on this like a laser.
Bonnie Glaser, absolutely appreciate your time, sharing your experience and your expertise with us. Thank you so much, and hope you come more often, both to India and to our studios.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
Complete pleasure. And to our viewers, do give us feedback on this interview. You can follow all our social media handles for the latest that we post on our website, or interviews like this with Bonnie Glaser on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.